Hi everyone, I'm Alexandra Attia. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Medieval Studies here at the University of Toronto. And today I wanted to talk to you about the Croxton play of the Sacrament. And specifically, I wanted to talk to you about ideas of translation and exchange in Croxton. So one of the things you may have noticed when you were reading the play is that Croxton seems to be set in two different places at once. On the one hand, it's set in England, in Croxton specifically, which probably is referring to a town in East Anglia, a region east of London. There are actually many places in England called Croxton, but based on place names and the dialect of the play, scholars have pinpointed it to this one specific town that this text is probably referring to. So on the one hand, it seems to be set in England. On the other hand, it seems to be set in Aragon, which is a region of Spain, essentially. So the merchants make reference to Aragon throughout the play text. Aristorius sort of describes himself as the best merchant of Aragon. And also information in the banns preceding the play and a note at the end of the play describe this as a performance or a recreation of events that originally occurred in Aragon. So there seem to be these two different settings to this play. And this is what I've been thinking about a lot in my own research lately. What does it mean to have the play be set in two different places at once? Why, at the one hand, refer to specific places, a local town in England and specific places in East Anglia, and on the other hand, have the play set in Aragon and also have this information before and after the main play text that describes this as essentially a translation of events that originally occurred elsewhere. So the main issue that I've really been thinking about in my own research is to what extent can we think about the Croxton play of the Sacrament as a translation? And this sort of boils down to three main questions that I've been thinking through. The first question, which is sort of the most basic question, is Croxton a translation? And the answer to this is unequivocally, pretty clearly, no. There's no evidence that Croxton was based on an existing work in another language. As far as we know, Croxton starts as a Middle English play. It's first written in English. There's no other play that we know of that Croxton was based on. So on a most basic level, Croxton is not a translation. But there's another sort of related question that I think complicates this issue a little bit, which is, does the play text claim to be a translation? And for this, I would say the answer is yes. And I would be curious to hear your thoughts on this as well, because this is kind of more of a matter of interpretation than it is a fact. So I'd be curious to hear your interpretations of this. Do you think the play text is claiming to be a translation? I would argue that yes, it is claiming to be a translation. And that's largely because of the information in the banns preceding the text and the note after the text that I mentioned. So not only is the play set in Aragon, but there's also this information before and after the text that contextualizes the play as the product of another region or another language. And then there's a kind of third question related to this issue, which is, was the play ever thought to be a translation? So this has to do with what later readers or audiences of the play might have thought. And this can obviously be kind of difficult to gauge, but I would argue that the answer to this question also, surprisingly, is yes, based on some manuscript evidence. So Croxton, as you probably noticed from reading it, is set in the 15th century, in the 1400s. The manuscript is probably actually written down sometime in the 1500s. And then much later, possibly in the 1800s or 1900s, someone who owned the manuscript or cataloged the manuscript made a note on the manuscript saying that this play was said to be by a Spanish playwright, namely Pedro Calderón de la Barca. So there's information on the manuscript suggesting that at some point in the manuscript's history, this anonymous play was attributed to someone, and specifically to a Spanish playwright. It's important to state at the outset that Calderón de la Barca could not have written Croxton, because Calderón de la Barca is a very significant figure in Spanish drama, but he wrote in the 1600s, in the 17th century. And the Croxton manuscript is from the 1500s. So just for that and other reasons, there's absolutely no way he could have been the author. This is an erroneous attribution. It's wrong information, but at the same time, it suggests something about what later readers or what later owners of the manuscript or what later catalogers of the manuscript might have thought of this play. And it seems to be that they thought of it as the work of a Spanish playwright. So this is a really fascinating detail that I've been thinking about in relation to this play, and that I'll describe in a little more detail a little later on in this lecture. But basically, my key arguments are that Croxton is not a translation, but that the play text presents itself as a translation. And that has to do with the information from the textual evidence that I touched upon from the banns preceding the play, as well as the setting of the play and the note at the end of the play. And the second part of my argument is that Croxton, the fact that Croxton adopts the form of a translation has significant implications for the depiction of trade and exchange in the play. Another thing you might have noticed about the play as you're reading it is that it's very much about trade. The main characters are merchants. The plot centers on an active exchange. The plot is largely about this issue of buying and selling the host or the Eucharist as if it were any other type of commodity. It seems to, in a lot of ways, depict exchange in a very negative light. On the other hand, there are ways in which the play sort of complicates this overtly negative depiction of trade and exchange. And I would argue that one of the ways in which it complicates this overtly negative depiction of trade is by adopting the form of a translation and by reflecting on its own trajectory, by sort of describing the root of the play in the way that it describes some of the root of goods and trade throughout the body of the play as well. So those are the kinds of main things I've been thinking about. And I wanted to walk you through the research I've been doing and the questions I've been thinking about by first looking in a little more detail at the textual evidence that I mentioned earlier, then talking about the manuscript history. And Croxton has a bit of a strange manuscript history, and there's a lot of gaps and mysteries. There's a lot of things that we don't really know about the manuscript. And it raises sort of interesting questions as well about the date of the play. And also about what this play was thought to be. What did owners of this play think it was? So I'd like to go through the questions of the manuscript history, both to touch upon this attribution that suggests that someone thought this play was a translation at some point, and also to get into the question of the date of the play and the sort of gap between when the play is apparently set and the year that's mentioned in the play and the manuscript production itself. And thinking about that, the date of the play has fairly large implications for the significance of the play's setting. So that's the sort of third thing that I want to talk to you about, is the significance of the play's Aragonese or Spanish setting. And then lastly, I just want to touch on a little bit the implications of thinking about Croxton as a translation. This is what I've been trying to sort of work through in my research, and I haven't come to any complete conclusions yet at this point, but I'd like to just address some of the ideas that I've been thinking about and some of the ways in which I think the idea of a translation without an original really complicates the play in a lot of ways. And what does the sort of form of the play and adopting a form of translation suggest about what the play is apparently depicting? So to start with the textual evidence, I wanted to look a little bit more closely at the banns at the start of the play. So at the start of the play, one of the two announcers, essentially, of these bands, describes this play as this play that is represented now in your sight, which in Aragon was done, the sooth to say, in Heraclea, that famous city aright. So what is this saying here? This is saying that this play was essentially originally performed, or the events behind this play, the events that this play is depicting, were originally performed in Aragon, specifically in a city called Heraclea. And then a little later on, well, actually sort of after describing the main narrative of the play, this same announcer then describes how this miracle at Rome was presented in 1461, and then reiterates some of the kind of narrative of the play, that the Jews with Holy Sacrament did wath or harm in the forest said of Aragon. So essentially the bands are describing what this play is about and where it came from. So they're reiterating the plot of the play, but they're also telling you as the reader or the viewer where this play originated. And they're specifying that it originated in Aragon. And there's a lot to unpack here, especially in relation to place names. One is this city of Heraclea. It's a bit complicated to understand what this means, because as far as we know, there is no city of Heraclea that's in what is now Aragon. It's possible that it's referring to a city in Sicily, which at the time was an Aragonese territory, but it's really not very clear. And the same is true for the significance of Rome is really unclear here. Some scholars have suggested that it was maybe referring to a production of a different host play at Rome, but it's also, again, really not clear. However, for my argument and for what I've been thinking about, the accuracy of any of these place names is actually not really all that significant. What's more important is that these bands are setting up a kind of trajectory for the play and setting up a route for the play. That it starts in Aragon, it goes through the Mediterranean, and then it eventually comes to Croxton. And you see this at the end of the bands. It says, "And if it please you, this gathering that here is, at Croxton on Monday it shall be seen, to see the conclusion of this little process." So there's this kind of description of the way that the play essentially moves through the world and concludes at Croxton. There's also a lot to say about the depiction of Aragon in the sort of main body of the play text itself as well, but I don't really have time to get into that today. So what I'd like to do next is just jump to looking at this note at the end of the play. So this is after the play is finished. There's this note saying, "Thus endeth the play of the Blessed Sacrament, which miracle was done in the forest of Aragon." Again, reiterating that it occurred in this city, Heraclea, and reiterating the year. And I jumped to this part at the end because I think in the same way that the beginning kind of contextualizes this play as something occurring outside of Croxton, outside of England, outside of East Anglia, the conclusion of the play also reiterates this idea that essentially this is a replication or translation of events that occurred elsewhere. So moving on to talking a little bit about the manuscript history. Croxton appears only in one manuscript, which is now in Trinity College, Dublin. So the manuscript is in Ireland, and there's only one copy of this play that we know of. So as I alluded to at the beginning of this lecture, although the play text mentions the date 1461, the manuscript is much later, probably from about 1550. So there's a fairly large gap between when the play seems to be set and the date of the performance that it claims to be recording, and when the manuscript is actually written down. And we can get a sense of the date based on the types of handwritings, the style of handwriting that the scribes who wrote down the play used. It's a sort of later handwriting. It's not really the handwriting of the 15th century. And also some of the conventions by which it's written down seem to be imitating print drama. So the way that there's a dramatis personae, the way that the speech tags are written, and also possibly one note at the end of the play may be mimicking a printer's mark. So all these things are indications that this play is later than when it's set. Additionally, there's also evidence from the watermark on the paper suggesting that this play is probably later than 1461. So the play is currently in another manuscript with a whole lot of other papers, but it's not really clear how it came to be part of that manuscript. It doesn't, in terms of its content, really relate to those other papers at all. And also the first and last page of Croxton are worn down in a way that suggests that probably at some point it circulated independently, and that's why it's sort of that its first and last pages were at some point like front and back covers. And so that's why they got worn down, because it wasn't always part of this manuscript and wasn't always contained in this manuscript. So to give you just kind of a general timeline of both Croxton specifically and also of the manuscript of which it eventually became a part, I wanted to just sort of lay out a few of the key dates here. So 1461 is the date given in the playtext, as we discussed, and for the reasons also I just mentioned, this is the approximate date for when the manuscript is produced. Now, the manuscript that Croxton eventually becomes a part of has its own kind of separate history, and we know a little bit more about that. So that manuscript was owned by someone named John Madden, who came to Ireland in the 1690s. And that manuscript gets inventoried in 1697, but Croxton isn't mentioned. And again, after John Madden dies, there's still no evidence that Croxton was part of that manuscript. That manuscript gets donated to Trinity College in 1741. And then finally in 1745, there's a catalog entry that mentions Croxton as part of this manuscript. So we don't exactly know when it came to be part of this manuscript, but probably sometime in the 1700s, just based on the fact that there's this inventory from the late 1600s that doesn't include this. So just to summarize this slide, we have some information based on the qualities of the manuscript itself, suggesting this manuscript was produced in the 16th century. We don't really know how it came to be part of this manuscript that it eventually becomes part of. And we don't have a lot of other information about it until really the mid-1700s. In terms of authorship attributions, there's no authorship attribution on the original manuscript, but there are some initials that appear at the end of the manuscript. So one thing I'd actually like to show you, if I'm able to pull it up. So you can actually, if you're interested, on HathiTrust through the emergency access service that's been made available in the time of the, because of the pandemic, you can access a facsimile of the Croxton manuscript. So this is like a copy of a copy, because we're looking at a digitized version of a facsimile of the original manuscript, but it still allows you to see the manuscript. And let's see if this is going to freeze or not, but it allows you to see the manuscript and see the kind of different scribes and the way that they write. And yeah, it can be a really interesting thing to look at. I'm not sure if you've looked at this already or not, but if you are interested, it's easily available on HathiTrust. And one of the things that you'll notice at the end is that there seems to be this kind of monogram, maybe some initials, and what exactly these mean is not completely clear. One scholar, Tamara Atkin, has argued that it's actually a copy of a printer's mark. So it could be something like that, that it's not really, it doesn't seem to be an authorship attribution at all, but it might be indicating something about someone who owned the manuscript, or someone perhaps imitating the features of a printer. So That's the only sort of identifying information on the manuscript, and it's really extremely inconclusive and doesn't necessarily, in fact, completely doesn't tell us anything about who wrote it. It may tell us something about the production of the manuscript, but it doesn't tell us anything about who wrote it. And in that initial catalog entry from the 1740s, I don't believe there's any other also authorship attribution associated with Croxton. So essentially it's an anonymous play. That said, a later note in the manuscript, probably from 1800 or later, identifies Croxton as, quote, a miracle play said to be by Calderon. And this is referring back to that Spanish playwright that we discussed earlier, Calderon de la Barca. So as I mentioned earlier, this attribution is wrong. There's no way that he could have written this play, but I nevertheless find it really fascinating because it is the kind of only information that we have about what anyone thought about who the author of this play was. It's also interesting because Calderon de la Barca is associated with a genre known as auto-sacramentales or sacramental plays. And Spain, unlike England, has a fairly large and well-documented tradition of sacramental plays. So Croxton is really the only surviving example of a kind of medieval English sacrament play. But in Spain, there are sacramental plays from the 1500s and 1600s. And what exactly they are and how to define them is a little bit complicated because there's a big sort of range within the genre of what the plays themselves might be like. But one scholar has identified them as one-act allegorical plays in honor of the Eucharist that were performed out of doors at the Feast of Corpus Christi. And as I mentioned, Calderon de la Barca is considered to be the sort of defining example of this genre. However, his plays are not really anything like Croxton. They're allegorical, they're a completely different tone, they're not slapstick, they're not violent. So it's a very different, his style is very different, but nevertheless, I thought it was interesting that he's associated with this genre and that some later author essentially attributed Croxton to, which is set in Aragon and seems to have this kind of Spanish setting and is a play about the sacrament, to a Spanish playwright of the 17th century who's known for being associated with this genre. What exactly to make of this, I really don't know. It may be completely coincidental and insignificant, but I think it's an interesting thing, at least, to think about. So the manuscript history raises this one question about the attribution. It also raises a question about the significance of the date of the play. Because if we go back to this sort of timeline here, there's this fairly big gap between when the play text is set and when the manuscript is produced. There's potentially almost a 100-year gap, 50 to 100-year gap. And some of the scholarship on the setting of the play has looked at it as a kind of 15th century setting, and looked at what the significance of 15th century Spain might have been to the depiction of anti-Semitism in the play, to Aragon's role as a trading empire, and a lot of other really interesting questions. But I think this gap between the date given in the play text and the date of the production of the manuscript is also significant to the kind of dual settings of the play. Because within this whole period is when essentially the schism between the Catholic Church and the Church of England occurs, and you have Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon and his attempt to annul or divorce her, which kind of results in this schism, and then a kind of whole period of uncertainty about whether the daughter of Catherine of Aragon is going to rise to power, or the children, Protestant children from another marriage, another of Henry's marriages, are going to rise to power. And certainly by the end of by the early 1550s, really 1553, 1554, Mary, who is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, is also betrothed to Philip of Spain. And for example, there's an archbishop from Spain who comes over as an advisor and is writing about the Eucharist, publishing a treatise about the Eucharist in Spain, but while he's in London. So essentially he's writing while in London, but it's getting published in Spain. He's also involved in Corpus Christi processions. So there's a way in which Aragon and Spain are really implicated in these shifts between Protestant and Catholic that are occurring in England in the early 16th century. So I think that's also a whole other avenue to explore about this play, is how the significance of the setting changes depending on whether you treat it as a 15th or a 16th century play. So that's another issue that arises from thinking about the manuscript history. The other issue that arises from thinking about the manuscript history is just the fact that this ends up somehow in Ireland and we don't really know how. Does that suggest that this manuscript itself is the product of exchange in a different kind of way than maybe other medieval drama manuscripts, medieval English drama manuscripts specifically? So yeah, so now that we've thought a little bit about the significance of the manuscript history and the textual evidence, I just want to turn to quickly the implications of this. What are the implications of thinking about the play text as a translation or an exchangeable commodity? What does it mean that the banns seem to describe a trajectory of the play that mimics the way that Aristorius or Jonathus talks about trajectories of goods? What can we make of that? Do you think that's in some ways complicating the apparently negative depiction of trade in the play? Is it adding to that in some way? Is it contradicting that? The other thing that I've been trying to think about, which I'd also be really curious to hear your thoughts and interpretations on, is if the play is addressing ideas of relative value and the idea that certain things cannot be commodities, is it significant that Croxton is presenting itself in a way as a translation without any original text, that it's not really looking to an original text to describe its value, but only focusing on the fact that it is a translated and kind of replicated object? So those are the things that I've mostly been thinking through. This idea of translation, exchange, and relative value, and how Croxton kind of uniquely deals with those by in some ways adopting the form of a translation, and specifically adopting a form of a translation that doesn't refer to a specific textual original. So those are my thoughts, and that's the kind of general direction of my research. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts and interpretations on this topic.